You have to eat something.
Why are you helping me?
Because you need it.
In the year 2026, in the iron-cold heart of New Jersey, where neon lights mask the blood spilled in the gutters, Severin Morado, a man known as the Iron King, whose name once commanded silence in the most opulent boardrooms, was rotting in a shallow grave made of concrete and shadows. Betrayed by his own blood and left for dead in a basement safehouse he believed was his fortress, Severin lay broken, his burgundy suit stained with the price of a kingdom lost. While he nursed his wounds and plotted a vengeance that would burn the city to the ground, he never expected that the heavy silence of his tomb would be broken by the soft, rhythmic click-clack of patent leather shoes. Elowen, a 6-year-old girl in a simple pink dress, was a child of the light living above a world of darkness. While her father worked grueling double shifts to keep a roof over their heads, Elowen followed the scary sounds, past the laundry mountain to a door that shouldn't have been there. On that rain-slicked Tuesday night, as the Iron King prepared to die, he was met not by an assassin's bullet, but by the trembling hand of a child holding out a half-eaten peanut butter sandwich. Valuing his life at nothing, Severin was about to discover that the most powerful protection doesn't come from an army, but from the innocent heart of a little girl who decided that the monster in her basement was just a friend in need of a snack. Stay with me till the end, as what happened next made the first man realize that true strength is not in the magnitude of your size but in depth of your character. Before we continue, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe and comment where you are watching from. Now let's get into the story. The cold did not just touch Severin Morado, it owned him. It seeped through the fibers of his once immaculate burgundy suit, now shredded and stiff with dried copper-scented blood. As he leaned his head against the damp concrete wall of the basement, the darkness felt like a physical weight pressing against his shattered ribs. Every shallow breath was a reminder of the night the Iron King fell, a night defined not by a grand battle, but by a handshake that turned into a blade in the ribs. The memory played on a loop in the theater of his mind. Just 6 hours ago, the air had been thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the salt of the Atlantic City breeze. He had stood on the balcony of his penthouse with Dante, his right hand, the man he had pulled from the gutters of Newark 20 years ago. They were supposed to be celebrating the expansion of the Morado territory. Instead, Severin had felt the sudden, hot bite of steel between his shoulder blades. "The world is changing, Sev," Dante had whispered into his ear, his voice devoid of the loyalty that had sustained them for decades. "Kings become relics. And relics belong underground." Severin hadn't died, not then. He was too strong, too stubborn, a man forged in the fires of the old country. But the betrayal had been surgical. His security detail had been bought, his accounts frozen, and his body dumped in the back of a black SUV. They had brought him here, to a safe house on the outskirts of Jersey City that Severin had bought years ago as a contingency plan, a place so off the grid that even the shadows didn't have names. Dante had laughed as they dragged him down the wooden stairs, tossing him into the dirt-floored basement among rusted water heaters and forgotten crates. "No one is coming for you," Dante had sneered, kicking him squarely in the chest. "This neighborhood is a ghost town. The bank foreclosed on the whole block. You'll rot in your own castle alone." Then, the heavy thud of the cellar door. The turn of the bolt. The absolute, suffocating silence of a man buried alive. Now, hours into his confinement, Severin's fever was rising. His tattoos, symbols of his long climb to the top, felt like they were burning into his skin. He gripped a shard of broken wood he'd found in the dark, his fingers trembling. He was waiting for the end, his mind already drifting toward the cold void of death, when the impossible happened. A sound. It wasn't the heavy, murderous tread of Dante's soldiers. It wasn't the scratching of rats in the walls. It was a light, rhythmic thudding from directly above his head. Thud-thud, thud-thud. Then the muffled, unmistakable sound of a television, the high-pitched jingle of a cartoon. Severin's eyes snapped open, glowing like a wolf's in the dark. Dante was wrong. The house wasn't empty. A family was living above his grave, oblivious to the dying monster beneath their floorboards. The realization brought a surge of adrenaline that tasted like iron. He wasn't alone. But in his world, a witness was just another casualty. As he looked up at the cracks in the ceiling, a single drop of warm water fell onto his forehead, not a leak, but a sign of life. Someone was washing dishes. Someone was safe. And then he heard the small, curious voice of a child calling out for her "Daddy" from the hallway above. Severin gripped his makeshift weapon, his heart hammering against his ruined chest, realizing that the war he had brought to this house was about to find its way through the basement door. Upstairs, the world was a symphony of ordinary safety. The low hum of the refrigerator, the distant sirens of Jersey City, and the soft glow of a nightlight shaped like a star were all Elowen knew of the world. Her father, Elias, had left for his second shift an hour ago, leaving her with a warm bowl of pasta and strict instructions to stay on the sofa until the sitter arrived. But Elowen was 6, and in the quiet of the drafty house, the silence began to speak. It started as a low, ragged vibration beneath the floorboards, a sound like a heavy trunk being dragged across gravel. To Elowen, it sounded like a giant caught in a bad dream. She hopped off the sofa, her pink dress fluttering, and followed the sound into the kitchen. Behind the mountain of unfolded laundry in the pantry sat a small wooden door, painted the same dull white as the walls, nearly invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for a secret. Elowen pushed aside a basket of towels and turned the cold brass knob. The stairs beyond were a throat of darkness, smelling of damp earth and old copper. She didn't feel afraid. Her storybooks were full of brave princesses who found magic in the places others ignored. Step by step, her patent leather shoes made soft, echoing clicks against the wood. At the bottom of the stairs, the air turned freezing. In the corner, slumped against a rusted pipe, sat the monster. Severin Morado flinched as a beam of light from the open pantry door cut across his face. He gripped the jagged piece of wood, his knuckles white, his vision swimming with fever. He expected a hitman, a blade, or a bullet. Instead, he saw a halo of dark hair and a pair of wide, shimmering eyes. "Are you okay?" The voice was tiny, floating through the gloom like a paper boat on a dark river. Severin's breath hitched. He tried to growl, to tell her to run, but his throat was a desert. He looked like a nightmare. His burgundy suit was black with filth, and the tattoos on his neck seemed to writhe in the dim light. He waited for her to scream. Elowen stepped closer, her curiosity outweighing her caution. She saw the cuts on his face and the way he clutched his side. In her world, there were no mafia bosses or betrayals, only people who were hurt and people who weren't. She noticed the way he looked at the stairs, then back at her, with a look of profound, aching loneliness. "Your daddy's friend, aren't you?" she whispered, her face scrunching in sympathy. "The one he said was coming to help with the pipes? You look really tired, Mr. Friend." Severin stared at her, the jagged wood slipping slightly from his hand. He was a man who had ordered executions with a nod, yet he found himself paralyzed by the simple, misplaced kindness in her voice. He didn't correct her. He couldn't. For the first time in a decade, someone wasn't looking at the Iron King. They were looking at a man who was bleeding. "Hungry," he managed to rasp, the word feeling like broken glass in his mouth. Elowen nodded solemnly, her long dark hair swaying. "Don't go anywhere," she instructed with the gravity of a doctor. "I have a snack. Daddy says sharing makes the heart grow. I'll be right back, Daddy's friend." As she turned and scrambled back up the stairs, leaving him in the encroaching dark, Severin let the wooden shard fall to the dirt. He closed his eyes, a single hot tear carving a path through the grime on his cheek. The Iron King was supposed to be dead, but Elowen had just given him a reason to breathe. The silence of the basement returned, but it was no longer absolute. Above, the floorboards groaned under the frantic, light footsteps of a child on a mission. Severin leaned his head back against the cold stone, his pulse thundering in his ears. His mind, clouded by the haze of infection and exhaustion, struggled to reconcile the two realities now clashing in this tomb. In one world, he was the Iron King, a man who had survived 3 assassination attempts and built a billion-dollar empire on the bones of his enemies. In the other, he was a sad friend waiting for a snack. He looked at the jagged wooden shard lying in the dirt. He should pick it up. He should be ready. If those footsteps belonged to anyone else, he would have to kill them or die trying. But as the pantry door creaked open again and a sliver of warm yellow light spilled down the stairs, his fingers refused to move. Elowyn descended carefully this time, her tongue poked out in concentration as she balanced a small plastic plate. She moved with the grace of a tiny tightrope walker, avoiding the cobwebs and the rusted pipes that Severin had viewed as instruments of his demise. When she reached the bottom, she knelt in the dirt, oblivious to the way the filth smudged her pale pink hem. "I had to be quiet," she whispered, her eyes wide and serious. "The walls have ears, Daddy says. But I think he means the neighbors." On the plate sat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, cut into lopsided triangles, and a handful of slightly wilted grapes. To a man who had dined in Michelin-starred restaurants and toasted with vintage Cristal, it should have looked pathetic. To Severin it looked like a miracle. He reached out, his hand trembling so violently that the tattoos of thorns across his knuckles seemed to shake. His skin was caked in grime and dried blood, a stark contrast to the soft, porcelain perfection of the little girl's outstretched hand. For a heartbeat, he hesitated, terrified that his touch might somehow taint her. "Eat, Mr. Friend," she urged, pushing the plate closer. "It's the good jelly. The strawberry kind." Severin took a triangle of the bread. His first bite was a revelation. The sweetness of the jelly and the salt of the peanut butter hit his tongue, and for a moment, the stabbing pain in his ribs faded into the background. He ate with a desperate, animal hunger he hadn't felt since he was a boy on the streets of Newark. He didn't realize he was making a low, guttural sound in his throat until Elowyn reached out and patted his knee. "Slow down," she giggled softly. "You'll get a tummy ache." As he chewed, his eyes locked onto hers. He saw no fear there. No ulterior motive. No shadow of the betrayal that had put him here. He realized then that Dante had been wrong. He wasn't rotting in his own castle. He was being sustained by a kingdom he didn't even know existed, one built on simple sandwiches and the unwavering belief that a stranger in the dark was just a friend who hadn't been fed yet. The Iron King swallowed the last of the sandwich, the warmth of the food beginning to spread through his frozen limbs. He looked at the little girl, his vision finally clearing. For the first time in days, the fire of vengeance in his chest was replaced by a strange, terrifying spark of hope. "Thank you, Elowyn," he rasped, her name feeling like a prayer on his lips. She beamed at him, standing up and dusting off her dress. "You're welcome. I have to go watch my show now, but I'll come back tomorrow. Don't let the monsters get you." She turned and vanished into the light, leaving Severin alone in the dark. But as he sat there, the taste of strawberry jelly still on his tongue, he knew the monsters didn't stand a chance. Not as long as he had a friend upstairs. The heavy silence that followed Elowyn's departure was broken not by the ghosts of Severin's past, but by the weight of the present moving directly above him. Through the thin, uninsulated floorboards, the house spoke in a language of struggle. He heard the rhythmic click of a calculator, the frustrated scratch of a pen against paper, and the long, weary sigh of a man who carried the world on his shoulders. Severin sat in the dark, his back against a cold pipe, listening to Elias. He heard the crinkle of envelopes, bills, no doubt, and the muffled sound of a man counting coins. In the underworld, Severin dealt in millions, moving digits across offshore accounts with a flick of his wrist. Here, in the hollowed-out chest of Jersey City, he was listening to the sound of a father drowning in the shallow end of a bank account. The next morning, the pantry door creaked again. The sliver of light announced Elowyn's arrival before her soft footsteps did. She descended with a small plastic cup of water and a bruised apple, her expression solemn. "Daddy's sad today," she whispered as she sat cross-legged in the dirt, her pink dress a shocking splash of color against the gray concrete. The papers with the red numbers came in the mail again. He thinks I'm asleep, but I see him looking at the lights. He's afraid they'll go out. Severin took the water, his fingers brushing against hers. Your father, Severin rasped, his voice regaining some of its gravelly strength. What does he do? Besides worry? Elowin's face transformed instantly. The worry vanished, replaced by a radiant, unwavering pride. He's a hero, she said firmly, her chin lifting. He works at the big warehouse where the trucks are. He lifts heavy things all night so I can have my vitamins. And when he comes home, even when his back hurts, he fends off the dragons under my bed. He's the bravest man in the whole world because he never quits, even when he's tired. Severin stared at her, the apple held loosely in his hand. He thought of his own heroism, the men he had broken, the rivals he had buried, and the fear he had used as a currency to build his throne. He had called himself a king, but as he looked at the dirt on Elowin's knees and the light in her eyes, he realized he was nothing more than a scavenger. He had lived a life of gold and blood, yet he didn't possess a fraction of the virtue Elowin saw in a man who struggled to pay for electricity. A hero, Severin repeated, the word tasting bitter and strange. Yeah, Elowin nodded. He says that being a man means taking care of the people you love, no matter what. That's why he's helping you too. Because you're his friend and you're hurt. The lie felt like a hot coal in Severin's chest. He wasn't a friend, he was a parasite, a lethal shadow hiding beneath their feet. He looked at his hands, the tattoos, the scars, the blood beneath the nails, and for the first time in his life, he felt a profound, gut-wrenching shame. He had spent his life fighting for power, but sitting in that basement, being fed by a child who believed in a goodness he didn't possess, the Iron King felt smaller than the smallest spark of a nightlight. He realized then that if he survived this, he couldn't just go back to being a monster. He had to become the man Elowin thought he already was. The days that followed were measured not by the ticking of a clock, but by the shifting of light through the cracks in the pantry door and the steady rhythm of Elowin's visits. Severin's fever had broken, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. His strength was returning, fed by lopsided sandwiches and the strange, quiet peace of the basement. He spent the long hours of the afternoon listening to the echoes from above, learning the melody of a life he had never known. When Elowin returned that evening, her usual spark was dimmed. She didn't skip down the stairs, she descended slowly, her small shoulders hunched. She sat in her usual spot, but instead of a story, she offered only a heavy silence. The world is loud today, little bird, Severin rasped, his voice now a steady hum in the dark. What's weighing on you? Elowin traced a circle in the dust with her finger. A boy at school, she whispered. Leo. He said my dress is old and that my daddy is just a janitor. He took my drawing and crumpled it up. I wanted to cry, but Daddy says we have to be nice. Severin felt a flicker of the old fire, the protective, predatory heat of the Iron King, rise in his chest. He shifted his weight, the burgundy silk of his ruined suit rustling against the stone. Listen to me, Elowin, he said, his tone shifting to something ironclad and certain. Being nice is a gift you give to people who deserve it. But being strong? That is a shield you carry for yourself. Bullies like Leo are like the shadows in this basement. They only look big because you're standing in the light. If you flinch, they grow. If you stand still, they realize they have no power over you. Elowin looked up, her dark eyes reflecting the sliver of light from above. How do I stand still? You look him in the eye, Severin instructed, the wisdom of 1,000 underworld negotiations distilled into a lesson for a child. You don't say a word. You let him see that his mean words are like pebbles hitting a mountain. You show him that your value doesn't change just because he can't see it. A king, or a queen, doesn't need to shout to be heard. They just need to know who they are. Elowin processed this, her small face set in a look of intense concentration. So, I don't have to be a monster to stop a monster? The question hit Severin harder than any bullet ever had. He looked at his scarred knuckles, the ink of his violent life etched permanently into his skin. He had spent his life being the monster to stop others, never realizing there was another way. No, he said softly, the edges of his voice rounding with a newfound tenderness. You just have to be the mountain. You stay kind to your father, and you stay kind to yourself. But to Leo? You stay stone. Elowyn reached out, her small hand covering his tattooed thumb. You're a very smart mountain, Mr. Friend. I think I'm going to draw you a new picture tomorrow. A picture of a mountain in a suit. As she climbed back to the world of light, Severin leaned his head against the cold pipes. He had taught her how to survive the wolves of the world, but she was teaching him something far more dangerous to a man like him, that he was capable of more than just destruction. He was learning that a hand used to crush could also be used to guide. And for the first time, the Iron King found himself hoping he'd live long enough to see the mountain she would become. The sanctuary of the basement, once a cold tomb and then a quiet classroom, was suddenly pierced by a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Severin felt it before he heard it, that prickling sensation at the base of his neck that had kept him alive in the trenches of the underworld for 2 decades. The rhythm of the house above had changed. The playful patter of Elowyn's feet had stopped, replaced by the heavy, ominous silence of a world holding its breath. Outside, on the rain-slicked pavement of the Jersey City cul-de-sac, a black sedan with tinted windows prowled the curb like a shark in shallow water. It didn't belong here. This was a neighborhood of rusted sedans and minivans with mismatched doors, a place where luxury was a foreign language. The car slowed to a crawl in front of the peeling gray house, its headlights cutting through the fog like twin daggers. Inside the sedan, the glow of a tablet illuminated the jagged scar on the driver's cheek. The Jeebus on the SU pings here, a voice rasped, cold and devoid of mercy. The boss's safe house. Dante said it was empty, but there's a tricycle on the porch and a light on in the kitchen. Check it, came the reply from the shadows of the back seat. If he's in there, he's a ghost. If there are witnesses, make them ghosts too. Down in the dark, Severin pressed his ear to the cold stone foundation. He heard the muffled thud of car doors closing, 3, maybe 4. He heard the metallic snick of suppressed handguns being readied. His heart, once slowed by the peace of Elowyn's company, kicked into a violent, rhythmic gallop. He looked at the stairs, then at the jagged wooden shard he had kept hidden in the dirt. He was still weak, his ribs a map of agony, but the Iron King was no longer fighting for a throne. He was fighting for the hero upstairs and the little girl who believed in mountains. Above him, the front door creaked. Elowyn. Elias's voice drifted down, tight with a confusion that was rapidly curdling into fear. Honey, get away from the window. Why are those men in the yard? The sound of the heavy front door being kicked off its hinges echoed through the floorboards like a thunderclap. Severin stood up, his muscles screaming, his vision tunneling into a red haze of lethal intent. The shadow wasn't just approaching, it was inside the house. The world of pink dresses and peanut butter sandwiches was about to collide with the world of lead and betrayal, and Severin Morado knew that he was the only monster in the dark capable of biting back. He gripped the wooden shard, his eyes fixed on the pantry door, waiting for the first shadow to cross the threshold of his grave. The atmosphere in the house shifted from a quiet sanctuary to a pressure cooker of unspoken fear. Upstairs, Elias stood by the kitchen trash bin, his breath hitching as he stared at a discarded strip of white cloth. It was stained with a violent, unmistakable crimson. He had found it tucked beneath a pile of Elowyn's crayon drawings, a jarring intrusion of reality into their fragile peace. He looked at the pantry door, the door he had always kept locked, the door he hadn't opened in weeks. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He wasn't a man of violence. He was a man of labor, of long shifts and calloused hands. But the sight of that blood triggered a primal instinct. He thought of Elowyn's recent odd behavior, her missing snacks, and her whispers about a sad friend. Fear for his daughter transformed into a cold, desperate courage. Elias grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the stove, his knuckles white, and moved toward the pantry. Below, the basement was a tomb of anticipation. Severin heard the click of the lock. He didn't see the light of a child this time. He saw the long, trembling shadow of a man driven by a father's protective rage. Severin pulled himself upright, his back scraping against the stone. He discarded the wooden shard. He knew that to hold a weapon now would be to sign this man's death warrant, and for the first time in his life, the Iron King chose vulnerability over tactical advantage. Elias rounded the corner, the skillet raised, his eyes wide and wild. He stopped dead when he saw the man in the shadows. He didn't see a mob boss. He saw a wreck of a human being in a ruined burgundy suit, his face a map of scars and fresh wounds, sitting amidst Elowyn's scattered toys. "Who are you?" Elias's voice was a jagged whisper, shaking with the effort of not breaking. "What have you done to my daughter?" Severin looked up, his gaze steady despite the agony in his side. He saw the sweat on Elias's brow and the terror in his eyes, the same terror he had seen in Elowyn's when she talked about the red numbers on the bills. "I have done nothing but eat the food she offered," Severin rasped, his voice low and hollow. "She is safe. She is the only reason I am still breathing." "You're a monster," Elias spat, though the skillet lowered an inch as he saw the sheer exhaustion in Severin's posture. "I saw the men outside. I saw the car. You brought death to my house." "I brought a war," Severin corrected him, his eyes softening with a strange, painful respect. "But your daughter, she brought a peace I didn't deserve. You are the hero she says you are, Elias. You shield her from the world, while I am the world you shield her from." The two men stood in a silence heavy with the weight of their different worlds. One lived to provide, the other had lived to take. But in that basement, surrounded by the scent of damp earth and the echoes of a child's laughter, they were just two fathers, one trying to save his child's life, and the other realizing his life was only worth saving if he protected the child who had fed him. The standoff held, a fragile bridge between a king and a laborer, just as the sound of a window shattering upstairs announced that the war had finally arrived. The sound of shattering glass from the floor above was followed by the rhythmic, heavy thud of tactical boots. The house, once a sanctuary of whispered lessons and peanut butter sandwiches, was now a kill zone. Severin saw the shift in Elias's eyes, the paralyzing terror of a man who realized that his iron skillet was no match for the professional violence currently pouring through his windows. "Get her," Severin commanded, his voice no longer a rasp but a cold, sharp blade. "Elias, get Elowyn and get to the back of the crawlspace. Now." Elias didn't hesitate this time. The instinct to protect his daughter overrode his fear of the man in the dirt. He scrambled up the wooden stairs just as the first suppressed gunfire coughed into the drywall above. Severin was alone in the dark, his breath hitching against the agony of his ribs. He looked at the rusted radiator pipe he was cuffed to, a final precaution Dante's men had taken before leaving him to rot. 4 days he had waited for death, but the Iron King was dead. The man who remained was a mountain, and mountains did not move for cowards. He didn't use a key, he didn't have one. Instead, he gripped the cold iron of the radiator, his muscles screaming in protest. He remembered Elowyn's small hand on his knee, her voice calling him a hero, and her belief that he was her father's friend. He couldn't let that lie die in the blood of an innocent family. With a guttural, animal roar that tore from his lungs, Severin threw his entire weight against the rusted mounting. The sound of snapping bolts echoed like a gunshot in the cramped space. The radiator groaned, wood splintering as the pipe tore free from the rotted floor joists. Severin tumbled forward, the heavy iron cuff still biting into his wrist, but he was mobile. He was a predator unleashed in his own grave. Upstairs, a scream cut through the air, "Elowyn." The sound acted like a jolt of pure adrenaline to Severin's heart. He didn't feel the pain in his side or the fever in his blood. He surged toward the stairs, the broken pipe dragging behind him with a metallic ring. As the pantry door at the top of the stairs was kicked open by a man in a black balaclava, Severin didn't flinch. The hitman didn't even have time to level his weapon. Severin lunged from the shadows, a specter of burgundy silk and raw vengeance. He swung the heavy iron cuff like a flail, the weight of the broken radiator mounting catching the assassin square in the temple. The man collapsed without a sound. Severin stepped over the body and into the kitchen. The light of the stove flickered against his bruised face. He saw Elias huddled in the corner of the hallway, shielding Elowin with his own body as a second shadow moved through the living room. Severin stood tall, his silhouette framed by the darkness of the basement door. He looked at Elowin, whose eyes were wide with a terror no child should ever know. "Don't look, little bird," Severin whispered, his voice steadying. "Close your eyes and count to 10. The mountain is here." He turned toward the encroaching killers, his fingers curling into a fist. He was broken, he was bleeding, and he was outnumbered, but for the first time in his life, the Iron King wasn't fighting for power. He was fighting for the light, and he would burn every shadow in the room to keep it from going out. The living room erupted into a symphony of controlled chaos. The second hitman pivoted, his suppressed rifle spitting sparks that hissed past Severin's shoulder and chewed into the kitchen cabinetry. Severin didn't flinch. He was no longer a man composed of flesh and fragile bone. He was a force of nature fueled by a debt that transcended blood. He closed the distance with a predatory burst of speed, ignoring the agonizing snap of a rebroken rib. He drove the heavy radiator cuff into the gunman's chest with the force of a battering ram, the sheer weight of the iron folding the man in half. "Go! The back door!" Severin roared over the ringing in his ears. Elias, galvanized by the sight of the Iron King, holding the line, scooped Elowin into his arms. He didn't look back at the carnage. He sprinted for the rear exit, his boots thundering against the floorboards he had worked so hard to keep. Severin watched them disappear into the night for a fraction of a second, a flicker of peace crossing his face before the front windows exploded inward. Dante's men were pouring in now, shadow silhouettes against the street lamps. Severin took a hit to the shoulder, a hot iron brand that spun him around, but he refused to fall. He used the kitchen island as cover, his breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. He was fading. The world was beginning to tilt, the edges of his vision curling into a dark, velvet gray. He had given them enough time. He had been the mountain. Just as the lead hitman leveled his weapon for an executioner's shot, the street outside was swallowed by the roar of high-performance engines and the screech of tires. The front door wasn't kicked, it was obliterated. "Morado," a thunderous voice barked. It was the Iron Guard, Severin's loyalist faction, led by his oldest enforcer, Matteo. They moved through the house with the surgical precision of a hurricane, neutralizing Dante's remaining men in a hail of gunfire that lacked the subtlety of silencers. The tide hadn't just turned, it had evaporated. Matteo rushed to the kitchen, skidding to a halt beside the slumped figure in the burgundy suit. Severin was leaning against the stove, his hand pressed to his side, his white shirt now a map of scarlet. But he wasn't looking at his men. His eyes were fixed on the open back door, where the rain was drifting in onto the linoleum. "Sir, we have the perimeter. Dante is being hunted as we speak," Matteo reported, his voice thick with relief. "Let's get you to the medics." Severin gripped Matteo's forearm, his fingers stained with the grime of the basement and the salt of the earth. "The family," he wheezed, his voice barely a whisper. "Find them. Protect them. They fed the king when he was a beggar." As the medics swarmed him, Severin felt the heavy weight of the iron cuff being cut from his wrist. He looked at the floor, where a single grape from Elowin's plate had rolled during the struggle. He reached out and touched it, a small smile ghosting across his bloodied lips. He had lost his kingdom in the skyscrapers, but he had found a soul in a basement. The debt was repaid, and for the first time in his life, the Iron King felt truly wealthy. The seasons had shifted, the iron-gray slush of a New Jersey winter giving way to the soft, emerald promise of spring. In a quiet suburb miles away from the jagged skyline and the blood-soaked basements of his former life, a house sat nestled behind a white picket fence, its windows glowing with a warmth that had nothing to do with neon or fire. Elias moved through the small garden, his posture no longer slumped by the crushing weight of red numbers. He wore a clean shirt, his hands, once calloused and trembling, now steady as he helped Elowin plant a row of bright yellow primroses. There was a peace in his movements, the quiet dignity of a man who had been given a second chance by a ghost. His warehouse shifts were a memory. He now managed a logistics firm with a salary that felt like a dream, a position that had materialized just weeks after the night the safe house burned. Elowin laughed, her dark hair catching the golden hue of the setting sun. She was wearing a new dress, not a simple rag, but a vibrant, lace-trimmed thing that made her look like the princess in her storybooks. She paused, looking toward the thick line of oak trees at the edge of the property, her small face scrunched in thought. She waved at the shadows, a knowing, innocent smile playing on her lips. Deep within the silhouettes of the trees, hidden by the burgeoning leaves, Severin Morato watched. He stood tall, his burgundy suit replaced by a sharp, midnight black overcoat that hid the scars on his shoulder and ribs. His face was healed, the jagged lines now silver memories of a war he had officially left behind. In the eyes of the world, the Iron King was dead, his empire dismantled and absorbed by those he had chosen to lead in his wake. In reality, he had simply moved his throne to the shadows. He watched Elias hand Elowin a small watering can, the sight of their safety filling a void in his chest he hadn't known existed until a little girl offered him a peanut butter sandwich in the dark. He no longer hungered for the cold thrill of power or the hollow satisfaction of vengeance. He had discovered a more potent authority, the power to provide light for those who had seen his soul when he was at his darkest. Severin reached into his pocket and touched a small, laminated drawing. A lopsided mountain wearing a suit, colored with a single pink crayon. It was his most prized possession, his true crown. He didn't need them to know he was there. He didn't need a thank you. Being Daddy's friend was a title he would carry until his final breath, a secret oath to protect this small kingdom of kindness from a world that didn't deserve it. As the porch light flickered on and Elias called Elowin inside for dinner, Severin took one last look at the family. He stepped back, melting into the darkness of the woods. He was a monster no more, and he was more than a king. He was a guardian. And as the stars began to poke through the twilight, the Iron King finally turned his back on the night, finding his own redemption in the quiet glow of a home he had died to save.